At first glance, lots of wrestlers may seem unique, but the truth is, for most of them, there are at least one or two people out there who fit the same bill. Yes, even notable standouts like Brock Lesnar have other performers with similar body types, and when it comes to the athleticism of someone like AJ Styles, for as impressive as he is not the only person on the planet who can do the things he does. But what about those wrestlers who are truly one of one? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the tallest wrestler to ever live, Giant Gonzalez. Yes, well, there have been a lot of big men in the wrestling industry over the years, a few of whom have even stretched to 7 foot tall and above. We're talking about names like Andre the Giant, the Big Show, and the Great Khali here. None have ever made it quite as close to the sky as George Gonzalez did. How tall was he exactly? Well, at his peak, he was billed at 8 feet tall, and while this may have been exaggerated, he was still a huge man in reality, standing at around 7 foot 7 inches, with this not only making him one of the tallest wrestlers ever, but also one of the tallest humans, full stop. Needless to say then, this served the Argentinian very well during his early career as a basketball player as, being the size he was, he never had any problems dunking the ball. Hell, so much success did he have in basketball, he at one point even got drafted by the Atlanta Hawks. But this is not what most wrestling fans know Giant Gonzalez for today. No, they know him for his runs in both WCW and WWF during the late 80s and early 90s, as it was there that each promotion did everything they could to position the big man as the second coming of Andre the Giant. Sure, this might have never worked out quite as well as people had hoped, mostly because Andre had a unique charisma on top of his size, which was near impossible to replicate. But even if this is the case, Gonzalez still managed to have some notable moments inside the squared circle, with the most notable probably being the feud he had with The Undertaker in 1993. You know the one. It's the program which gave us that infamous WrestleMania 9 match between the pair. The one in which the dead man came closer than ever to losing and having his streak end before it even got started. That said, even if he did have famous moments like these, his sheer size meant there was always going to be a time limit on how long Giant Gonzalez's body could hold up, and that time limit expired in 1995, at which point he would move into retirement and remain there right up until his passing in 2010. But what about the flip side to this coin, the shortest wrestler ever? Surely there would be nothing stopping them from having a longer run, right? Well, let's find out the answer to that question right now as we look at our next subject, Microman. That's right, for as long as wrestling has existed, little people have always been a part of the sport. But while in the early carnival and territory days of it, these wrestlers would often not be taken seriously, in recent decades this has changed, and now those with dwarfism or other similar conditions can be presented far better. And nowhere is this truer than Mexico, as it's there little people often have the easiest time getting over, something which has certainly been the case for Microman ever since 2017. What makes Microman so special? Well, aside from being a very good wrestler, he also has the unique status of being the shortest wrestler to ever lace up a pair of boots. And that's because he stands at just 3'3" in height. Obviously then, this makes his matches must-see just for the visuals alone, as regardless of whether he's fighting another little person in his home promotion of CMLL or a larger athlete on the indies, he always gets fans on his side. Seriously, if you've never seen this Mexico City native do his thing, now might be a good time to give the oldest wrestling promotion in existence a shot and watch the spectacle that is him coming out to a sold-out Arena Mexico and there giving the audience a show, either by going up against one of his chief rivals like Zacharias Perico or by putting his mask on the line against someone such as Shamuel. Hell, you could even tune into a GCW show in America and see Microman challenge Danhausen in a match that really has to be seen to be fully appreciated. Whatever you do, make sure you give the Mexican credit, because as the shortest wrestler on record, he certainly deserves his flowers for being able to have the success he's had. Where will Microman go from here? Well, while we don't expect him to move to America full-time or anything, given CMLL currently has a working relationship with AEW, there's every possibility we see him show up at a Forbidden Door show in the future. But let's move away from the shortest wrestler ever for now and over to the heaviest instead. Who fits the bill when we're talking about this accomplishment? Well, that would be our next subject, Happy Humphrey. Now, Happy Humphrey might not be a name that everyone is aware of, and that's because his time in the ring came long before any of the boom periods we're familiar with today. No, his time came during the early territory days of the 1950s and early 1960s. What did Humphrey do back then? Well, as someone who weighed a mammoth 802 pounds at his peak, he was primarily used as a special attraction who could move around the different territories and show up from time to time in each one in order to pop a house. Yes, similar to how Andre the Giant would go from place to place, Happy Humphrey also made his size work for him. Sure, being as big as he was meant there wasn't a lot he could do physically in the ring, but back then Kurt Angle levels of great in-ring work weren't what fans were looking for anyway. Rather, what they were looking for was someone who seemed like they could win a fight, and in the case of this Georgia native, there were few people who could believably make a dent in him. Hell, so much did audiences believe in Happy Humphrey, at one point he'd managed to sell out Madison Square Garden when he and Haystacks Calhoun main evented a Vince McMahon Sr. promoted Capitol Wrestling show there in the late 50s. And when he wasn't doing this, he was doing things like wrestling a bear, all while elsewhere he was working with a young Harley Race. Obviously then, the footprint Humphrey has left on the industry has been a large one indeed, and that's why he's still remembered in the history books today. No, he's never really been positioned as a legend, and he's yet to get that Hall of Fame induction, but this could all change in the future. So don't let him be a part of history any longer. Remember Happy Humphrey as a spectacle unlike any other, someone who even Yokozuna was never able to best in terms of sheer weight. And remember that even after he retired, he was able to find further notoriety as a Guinness Book of World Records holder, though not for the feat you're thinking of. No, rather than holding the official record for largest wrestler, Humphrey is actually in that book for having the most dramatic example of weight loss, with him at one point dropping 570 pounds and reaching an altogether healthier 232 pounds during his later years. Quite an achievement, but while wrestling at that size and then dropping all that weight is certainly impressive, what's arguably even more impressive is wrestling with one foot. And that's what the situation was for our next unique subject, the one, the only, Kerry Von Erich. Of course, Kerry Von Erich didn't always wrestle with one foot. No, during his early days, he had all his extremities in place. And this, combined with his good looks, his superstar aura, and his excellent in-ring skills, made him a massive star in Dallas during the mid-80s. Hell, alongside his brothers, he was able to turn his father's promotion, World Class Championship Wrestling, into one of the hottest territories out there for a while, as the Von Erich kids' regular battles against the Fabulous Freebirds became appointment viewing for anyone in the area. But as anyone familiar with the curse of the Von Erichs clan will know, or as anyone who's seen the Iron Claw will be all too aware, tragedy would strike for Kerry in June of 1986, as that was when he was involved in a pretty serious motorcycle accident. One so serious it would leave him being forced to have his foot amputated. Still though, he wouldn't let this end his career or anything. No, keeping the incident quiet from everyone except his nearest and dearest, the Dallas native would simply strap on a prosthetic and hide it underneath his boot as he continued to wrestle for several years at a high level. Such a high level, in fact, he'd managed to live up to the man who'd only a couple of years previously been the NWA World's Champion. Unfortunately, though, working with one foot came at a price for Kerry, and that price was a painkiller addiction that he developed as he constantly found himself having to numb himself not only from the physical pain he was in, but also from the emotional pain he was suffering from following the passing of his brothers David, Mike, and Chris. And that meant by the time he was working for Vince McMahon's WWF, he was a shell of the performer he'd once been. But even then, he'd still managed to perform to high enough a level where he'd win the Intercontinental title at one point, with this being his last great achievement in the ring before his own untimely passing in 1993 at just 33 years old. That's right, it was a sad end to the story of Kerry Von Erich, but then there was a sad ending for all of the Von Erichs not named Kevin. We guess that's just how things go sometimes. And while he did go far too young, the Texas Tornado has to rank as one of the best examples of a disabled performer achieving more than anyone could have ever imagined. Seriously, his story has in many ways served as an inspiration for others with similar disabilities over the years who have since gone on to enter the ring themselves. And one of those people would be our next subject as it happens, the man who goes by the name of Zach Gowen, the WWE wrestler who had one leg. Now, if you were a fan of WWE during the early days of the Ruthless Aggression era, then you no doubt remember this one. After all, Zach's story was certainly one which was hard to forget. Yes, Gowen was forced to have his left leg amputated when he was just 8 years old. Obviously then, you would think that any dreams he had of becoming a wrestler would be over by this point. But refusing to let his situation hold him back, Zach started training a few years later anyway once he'd finally come of age. And while it was a lot more difficult for him to do things on account of his situation, he was able to commit to the entire endeavor enough that by the time 2003 came around, he'd find himself on the radar of WWE. Of course, as it turned out, it was actually a different one-legged wrestler the company were interested in at the time, something which then Head of Talent Relations John Laurinaitis was evidently unaware of when he signed Gowen up to a contract. But even if an error had been made here, WWE decided to just go with it once the Michigan native reported for duty soon thereafter, as they immediately saw in him someone who had an unquenchable desire to succeed. How would this fare for Zack's future? Pretty well in the short term, because almost immediately after being introduced to audiences, he'd find himself in a notable on-screen program with none other than Vince McMahon himself. That's right, mere weeks into his WWE run, the one-legged star would be doing things like teaming up with Stephanie McMahon to take on the boss's handpicked surrogate, The Big Show. And all the while he was doing this, he was managing to maximize his minutes by wowing audiences with his wrestling which involved him foregoing the use of a prosthetic and simply hopping around the ring on one leg. That said, as time went on and it became clear that there was going to be a ceiling on what Zack Gowen was going to achieve in WWE, that initial spark of interest in him started to wane, and this would lead to him gradually disappearing from TV altogether. But even if his run in WWE was over at this point, he'd still be able to wrestle for many years yet, with him from there moving over to places like TNA, Ring of Honor, and the Insane Clown Posse's Juggalo Championship Wrestling. Even as recently as 2024, in fact, he's been known to wrestle for an indie show here and there. But what if instead of only having one leg, you have none? Well, that's the situation when it comes to our next subject, a current-day indie superstar who goes by the name of Dustin Thomas. Never heard of Dustin Thomas before? Well, that may be because, outside of one cameo appearance he had at AEW's inaugural pay-per-view Double or Nothing in 2019 when he appeared in the Casino Battle Royal, he's never had a chance to shine on a large stage. No, ever since he got his start in the ring earlier that same year, the Denver native has very much been a fixture of the indies. But this hasn't stopped him from making a name for himself there, as unlike any other wrestler we can think of, he has no legs, with this being a reality he's been living with ever since they were amputated when he was just 3 years old. Needless to say then, despite growing up a wrestling fan, the idea that Dustin could ever become a performer himself seemed like a complete fantasy for a long time. After all, if one-legged wrestlers like Zack Gowen had such a hard time, then it was going to be twice as hard for Thomas to do anything. But so committed was he to making his dream happen, he'd persevere. And this would lead to a situation where in April of 2019, he'd find himself getting booked for a Game Changer wrestling show where he took on Tony Deppen in a match that got a lot of buzz online after the fact. And not just because it was such a unique sight to see either. No, despite his obvious limitations, Dustin Thomas proved here that he had a lot of athletic skill, with his version of the 619, dubbed the Nub 19, gaining particular acclaim from fans watching the show. And that would lead to him continuing to come back for further GCW appearances as the months and years went on. Hell, as it stands today, he's even got a couple of victories over opponents like KTB and Joey Janela to his name, meaning the future looks bright for this relative rookie. Will this eventually lead to him returning to AEW or getting a WWE contract one day? Anything's possible. All he has to do is keep improving at his craft, because he's already proven that having no legs is not something he's going to let hinder him. No, if he has his way, he'll be on television before long, and there showing the world exactly why he deserves the spot. Who knows? Maybe he'll even get to mix it up with our next subject, a current-day All-Elite alumni who wrestles at a high level despite being a Type 1 diabetic. Who are we talking about here? Why, Kyle O'Reilly, of course. Now, on the face of things, being a diabetic might not seem like it would be too much of a hindrance to someone living their daily life so long as they take care of themselves. But when you're talking about being a high-level athlete, then things definitely get a little bit more complicated. After all, the training regimen required to be a wrestler alone is going to be made exponentially more difficult when you're also worrying about your insulin levels at all times. And that's why it's so impressive that Kyle O'Reilly has been able to achieve so much, as he's been dealing with this condition ever since he was a young child. But then, when you're as dedicated as he is, this was never going to be an issue. No, not only would Kyle excel as a wrestler during his teens and 20s, he'd also excel as a practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and this latter skill would eventually be merged into his wrestling style, making him someone who always had unique, standout matches in places like Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and New Japan, each of which were venues he won gold in. In fact, in both Ring of Honor and PWG, the British Columbia native would become a world champion. That said, things would reach another level for him again when he was moved over to NXT in 2019 2017. As it was there, he became part of the Undisputed Era alongside Adam Cole, Roderick Strong, and Bobby Fish, in the process winning the NXT Tag Team titles on 3 separate occasions. And since then, he's moved over to AEW, where, once more alongside Adam Cole and Roderick Strong, he's recently become a key player in the Trios division, with his illness doing nothing to stop him in his eventual goal of winning those Trios titles from the Ops. But that won't be the end of Kyle O'Reilly's goals. No, we fully expect that once he's dethroned Samoa Joe and company, he'll be all about getting some singles gold too, perhaps even that TNT title his stablemate Adam Cole is currently in possession of. That's right, diabetes or no diabetes, Kyle O'Reilly's future looks bright as he's just too good to be held down by a condition like this. And he's not the only alumni of NXT who's too good to be held down by something that would hold most back. No, we could say the exact same thing about our next subject, Miles Bourne, someone who's making quite a name for himself in NXT despite being partially deaf. That's right, if you're an NXT fan, then you'll likely be aware of this one because, while it's never been fully acknowledged on screen as of yet, there have been plenty of references made by Miles and his No Quarter Catch crew stablemates to this over the last couple of years. But while you'd think that being almost fully deaf, something which occurred as a result of persistent pulmonary hypertension the Wilmington native had as an infant, would be a hindrance on his ability to perform in the ring, he's already shown this is not the case. No, even if he struggles to hear what's going on around him, including instructions from his opponents mid-match, Miles has been able to lip read ever since he was a child, meaning he's able to communicate in the ring in this way. And this has allowed him to get to the point where, now, only a few years into his career, he's already one of the brightest prospects on the NXT roster. Seriously, if we were looking at the stars of tomorrow who are currently learning their craft at the CWC, he'd be high up on the list of people we expect great things from. And that's because his work in the NQCC has been nothing short of excellent, especially when you take into account the fact that he's having to do all of this without being able to hear anything. Does this mean the main roster is in Miles' future? Almost certainly. And once there, we can expect him to show audiences watching Raw or SmackDown why being deaf is in no way a hindrance to him doing his thing. The only question is, how high will he rise? Could we be looking at a future Intercontinental Champion here? Or even a future WWE Champion? Anything is possible. And if he does win the big one at some point, we're pretty sure this will put him in the history books as the first deaf wrestler to call themselves the top dog in WWE. Of course, that's all in the future though. In the meantime, we're only too happy to watch Bourne continue to improve in NXT, all while he's making the odd excursion here and there to places like TNA or GCW, the latter of which allowed him to take on New Japan's Royce Isaacs at Josh Barnett's Bloodsport show on WrestleMania weekend this year. Yes, there's still a lot for this rookie to learn, and getting to go to other companies where he can pick up different ways of doing things is only going to make him a more rounded performer in the long run. Who knows? Maybe these indie showings will one day even allow him to step into the ring with our next subject, someone who is also missing a key sense, albeit a different one. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Crazy Steve, the wrestler who is legally blind? Yes, the first thing you might be asking yourself here is, how does someone who is blind manage to wrestle? Well, we're not sure. No, whatever magic Crazy Steve works in places like TNA and AAA, it's beyond us. Sure, he may not be completely without sight. No, like with other wrestlers who have had bad vision, such as Stan Hansen, the Ontario native can see a little. But with him being legally blind, what he can see for the most part is little more than shapes with no definition to them. Really, it's something of a miracle he's able to perform at all with this in mind, let alone to the high level he does, as whether it's in the States or in Mexico, Crazy Steve has long been a highlight of any roster he's been a part of. And that's exactly why, over the course of his run with Impact Wrestling, he's managed to not only become a key member of stables like the Menagerie and Decay, but also a one-time digital media champion and a one-time TNA Tag Team champion alongside Abyss. Will this ever lead to him getting a shot at one of the big leagues? Well, with him currently being a member of the AAA roster, and with that promotion just recently having been purchased by WWE, it means he's now technically a member of World Wrestling Entertainment too. The only question left then is, will Steve be able to make it over to Raw or SmackDown at some point, or even NXT? And if he does manage to do this, will his impaired vision be a hindrance to him in any way? If his prior career is anything to go by, it won't. And we say that with confidence because he's already had so much success, there's no reason to think things will slow down for him now. But even if he does remain in Mexico for the time being, Crazy Steve will continue to be one of the highlights of the AAA roster, with his work there in the tag team division allowing him to show that having a disability doesn't mean you have to cut your dreams short. But is Crazy Steve more unique than our next subject? Well, let's take a look at him then, the performer who gets in the ring despite having cerebral palsy, Gregory Iron. Obviously, having a neurological disorder like cerebral palsy doesn't mean you can't succeed in whatever path you choose to go down in life. No, actors like RJ Mitt, most famous for his portrayal of Walt Jr. in Breaking Bad, have shown that this is possible. But it may mean that life is going to be more challenging than it would be for most people, and that's why it's so impressive that Gregory Iron has had the career in the ring that he's had. Sure, he's never made it to a WWE, not yet at least anyway, but he has shown in places like Game Changer Wrestling, Chikara, and Pro Wrestling Ohio, with it being in the latter that he at one point got involved in a notable feud with a young Johnny Gargano and even scored a victory over the future DIY member. Obviously then, after getting a win like this, the Cleveland native's career on the indie scene started to take off in a big way, and that's allowed him to make a living as an in-ring performer ever since the late 2000s, all while being the only notable example of a wrestler with cerebral palsy. And that makes Gregory truly unique indeed. And it also means he's been able to be a part of a truly unique tag team at various points when he's teamed up with Zach Gowen, the one-legged wrestler we spoke about early on, in a partnership known as the Handicapped Heroes. Yes, the paths of these two men notably first crossed when they were working in Pro Wrestling Ohio in 2012. And it wouldn't be long after that before they were using their combined forces to win this company's tag team titles. Will we ever see Gregory Iron get that shot to make the jump to a larger stage? Anything can happen, because despite being a veteran now, he seemingly has no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Now, as recently as March of 2025, he was still performing on the indie scene, so don't discount the idea we could see him on Raw, SmackDown, or NXT. Whatever awaits him though, Gregory Iron will always go down as one of the most unique wrestlers out there, as so few are able to do what he does given the circumstances he has going for him. But then the same could be said about everyone else we've looked at today too, as they're each examples of someone being a one-of-one performer.